Hello, everyone. And I can see we've got a couple of people joining. Sorry for joining a minute or so late. I'm just going to give it a couple minutes to let a few more people join. This is the first time running a YouTube live event. So, yeah, I'll give it a few minutes and then kick off. So, what I'll do is I'll share my screen. Let me just see, I've got some people seeing how they join here actually. Okay, nice. Cool. So let me share this. Hello, hello, hello. Right, I'm going to share my screen. Sweet. If you have any problems with the audio or anything, just let me know. You can drop a message into the chat and I'll be monitoring that as we go through. Otherwise, I'll just give it another minute or so for a couple of people to join and then I'll begin. I know I started a minute or so late, but otherwise we are all good. Okay, they have a few more in there. Nice. Okay, sweet. Nice. Well, yes, welcome. So today I'm going to be talking through essential 360-degree growth strategies. The reason why I talk about 360-degree growth strategies is because often in life, especially for young professionals, it's very common to have a bit of a one-track mindset, especially for those of you who might be in the UK. It's very, very common that your professional career is sort of on a set path. However, the rest of your life maybe doesn't follow suit, or maybe you don't quite like that professional career path you're on. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how to think about your general growth and how to optimize your growth as a young professional. So the purpose of today is to go through these 360-degree growth strategies to empower high-performing young professionals to become the best all-round version of you. I guess the deeper purpose, like why am I bothering to do this, is because a few years ago, I was working in a corporate job and I didn't really have a sense of my purpose. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I kind of saw myself going along a standard corporate 40-year grad scheme, shall we call it. I wasn't particularly enthused by that. So what I've done is I've gone on my own journey, which I'll talk about another time, to become a coach. And what I've done here is compiled all the learnings I've had. And hopefully it'll be useful for some of you. So the agenda I've actually taken off a poll I did on my Instagram. So I was asking which kind of topics people would want to cover. So what I'm going to aim to do is balance it according to people's preferences. So just under half of the time I'll spend on clarity, so understanding what your core career purpose might be, your core values. I'll do a bit of work on like how you outline like effective goals and like the direction, but then I'll spend a fair bit of time, maybe a third, on the strategy. So what are the habits, the time management systems, the procrastination, goals, and so on that you can use to get there? Now, today will be pure value. So I would recommend having a pen and paper. We'll do a couple of exercises at the start that I'll sort of walk you through. There'll be a few where I'll sort of just like flash them up and we'll move on, that you can kind of make a note of, look up in your own time. My goal here is to give you as much value as possible in about 45 minutes for you to take home and do sort of as much work or thinking as you like to sort of excel your career. So the way that this works, and this aligns with the 360-degree program I run, is we're going to go through clarity. So what that means is the deep understanding of yourself. Then we'll look at, okay, how can you set goals for all life areas? And then we'll go into a roadmap. So how do you come up with that personalized strategy and action plan to actually get there? Often the kind of people I work with might have strengths in one area over another, but in general, covering these three bases should set you up for some good success. If you do have any questions as we go, feel free to pop them in the chat. I know a few people have submitted questions already, but unless it's something that sort of you think would benefit everyone, just leave them to the end when we do a Q&A. So to start with the first one, clarity. And this is that understanding yourself piece. If you want to sort of optimize your career as a young professional, you've got to understand who you're working with. So to start with, who do you think you are? I'm going to flip this and say that first, knowing who you are is, as Aristotle says here, the beginning of all wisdom. And we'll walk through a bit of like a life audit, your life purpose, your core values, and then some other exercises. So to start with, what I'd like you to do, if you've got a pen and paper ready, is just think about 6 to 8 categories based on your roles in life. So if you're thinking of your life, imagine if you could split it into the different areas. It might be like your work, your relationship with your partner, your friends, your family, or whatever. Just how might you think of 6 to 8 different areas in your life? So make a note. Once you're done, here are some, if you're struggling, here are some options. So you might have your role as a partner, as a parent in your family, your career, your professional development, your physical health, your mental health. If it's easier, this is how I split mine up. So I think of my relationship with others. So as a partner, with my family, my friends, I've got my mental health, my physical health, my personal development, and that encompasses things like learning, self-development, my professional development, that includes financial, and then passion projects in general. And in there, I include music and learning, things like this. The next thing you want to do is visualize the 10 out of 10 version of each of those areas. So within the next year or so, imagine if you couldn't fail, what would your life look like as a 10 out of 10 partner, as a 10 out of 10 family member, 10 out of 10 your relationship with all your friends, the best version? Just spend a minute overall noting it down. So for each one, just 1 or 2 words like, okay, what's the ideal situation on my physical health? Okay, I might have run a marathon, or my passion projects, or I would have started to, or something like that. To go through and have a little think of each one, you don't need to make a note, just have an idea in your mind of what the 10 out of 10 version maybe looks like. The key thing here, what I want you to do, is rank where you are now compared to your ideal version. So if you look at, I don't know, your physical health, if you think of where the 10 out of 10 version where you could be within the next year, that optimal version of you, where are you right now? Are you kind of halfway there? You might be a 5. Are you way off? You might be a 2 or 3. If you're pretty close, you might be an 8 or 9. So go through for each one and very quickly just note down, all right, okay, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever it is. It's going to come clear in a minute why we're doing this. Once you can draw a circle and plot each area of your life. Now, this is a technique called the Wheel of Life that Mayer came up with in 1960. And it's a very, very powerful visual tool, especially if you're a visual learner, because what you can do is you can actually see, if you see this graph here, you can massively see, okay, section 4, for whatever that might be in your area of life, that's somewhere where you might want to focus and prioritize. So this is a really good technique to start with, and you can do it more in your own time to understand where you might want to grow in your. Over time, you can apply this. So if you think about like temporal change, look at 5 years ago today, how would you rate each of those areas in your life out of 10? Now, today, where are you at and where do you want to get to? That would be 10 in every area. And as you see here, this is an example from one of my clients, actually. You can see, okay, this shows where we want to focus on growing. The reason why I've started with this example is what we're trying to do is start having a growth mindset. And this is why I'm going to flip that or challenge that assumption of who you are or who you think you are. Because as it says here, who you are today is not who you are. That is who you were. See, that's the culmination of all your past thoughts, behaviors, and actions. Everything you've done in the past has got you to where you are today. But if you look at where you are today and say, oh, this is who I am, and define yourself by it, you're kind of condemning yourself to stagnation because you are only taking into account what you've done in the past. But the truth is that every second, every decision you make as you go through life, you're choosing to live a certain way. And when you kind of understand this, you can really start embodying what I would, call a growth mindset and become a person who is constantly growing. So this is a really key thing to do. It's quite difficult, but once you get around that, it's powerful. Okay, so now I've done a little introduction into, okay, this Wheel of Life concept is a really good thing you can take home and do on your own to think about where you're at now and where you might want to go. And what we're going to have as a theme throughout this is this idea of a growth mindset. Now, I know there were some questions before about your career purpose. This is probably the most useful tool I found at the very start of my journey. Now, it's called Ikigai, the Japanese comes from the Japanese philosophy, which roughly translates to a reason for being. Now, that is a very complicated, very old Japanese philosophy. The Japanese philosophy is not this diagram, I should caveat by saying. This diagram is a very simplified version that Suzunaga first kind of made popular, and then there's the book which I read by Garcia Morales. But this is trying to very simply break it down for often people in the Western world to understand what their purpose in life might be like. If you're struggling to understand what you want to do in life, what your career purpose might be, this is where you should start. And this is where I started, and this is how I went on my journey from leaving my corporate job and being in a situation where I kind of thought I was probably living a 7 out of 10 life. This is then the thing that got me to being a 10. So there's 4 questions in this Ikigai. What do you love? What the world needs? What you're good at? And what you can be paid for? And the place I would start is what you'd love. So if you just think about like 10 things you absolutely love to do, maybe it's playing a sport, encouraging people, speaking to people, solving problems, whatever. Think about the things you love. Then you can think about the things you're good at. And if you can start combining the two, you have an idea of what your passions are. And then as you think about, okay, what types of things does the world need and what types of things can I be paid for? Now, all too often, people are stuck doing something. There's some balance of what the world needs. So there's already massive corporates that are like, well, it's debatable whether what they do the world needs, but there's a company there running a successful business. And then there's lots of jobs that you can be paid for. When you leave university, you come into this plethora of jobs where, okay, you can be paid for doing all sorts of things, normally some kind of financial corporate role. And the bridge of the two might be vocation, but it's not something you love. It might also not be something you're good at. If you're lucky, as you're a young professional, you're probably covering the bottom 3 with a hint of maybe some things you enjoy, but you don't really love it. Now, obviously, the flip side is you'll know people who do something they really love and they might be good at it, but there's no monetary value in it. And so that just stays as like a passion or a hobby. So if you can take time to go through each of these individually and see what is in the center of the Venn diagram, that's the best place to start for outlining where you want to go in your career. So as an example, this is the top 10 things I absolutely love to do. So I made this list probably 5 years ago, and I refer back to it over time. But the most important thing to do here, and the most powerful thing, is actually to think about, once you have an idea of the 10 things you love to do, how often have you done them over the past week? And which of these can you do daily? Because if you're living in a situation where, let's say, the top 10 things you love to do all revolve around, I don't know, being outside or being in the mountains, and you live nowhere near there, maybe it's time to sort of reconsider doing with your life. So a great example, as I said, if you're thinking about how to find your career purpose and so on and so forth, that's probably the number one thing you can do. Start with Ikigai and the top 10 things you love to do. So there are another few activities you can do. I'll skip past these, but asking yourself what you love to talk about, research, advance, contemplate, what you love to know a lot about. All of these self-reflection things, what we're trying to do here is go up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm not sure if you will have seen this model, but at the bottom, you've got your basic needs, like, okay, we need like food, water, security, things like this. Most people then that are working some kind of corporate job get to a point where, okay, they've kind of improved these. And so they start, focusing a little bit on their social circle, their psychological needs. But as you get to the top, what people are striving for is really to have this self-fulfillment. So that's what we're working on today. The next this is probably the final key area of this clarity piece that I want to talk about, is understanding your values. Now, often people will have heard of the idea of values, and they might have a situation where, I don't know, people they know have an idea of what their core values are. People might put it on their portfolio or their website. But what does it really mean? And I really like Anthony Robbins' way of splitting this up into values you move towards and values you move away from. So here's a quick list of values people might move towards. All I want you to do is think about the top, how you might sort of rank the top few. So what's the number one value right now you reckon you prioritize? Is it freedom, adventure, love, positivity, whatever? Just take a second. You'll see why, to note down the top 1, 2, or 3. Then what we're going to do is move on to the core values you move away from. What I'm trying to say here is there'll be certain things, say like rejection or humiliation, that kind of strike real fear into your heart. You will do anything to sort of avoid. So do the same exercise, but for these values that you try and move away from. Which is the 1 or 2 or 3 that you really, really, really try and avoid? Trust me, this is going to be pretty eye-opening. So once you've done that for the values you move towards, you've got an idea, okay, these are my top values I move towards, and these are the top values I move away from. What you can do is put them side by side. For example, this is pretty common that I'll see with a lot of clients. They'll say, right now, I reckon the top I'm trying to move towards are love, freedom, and success. Something like that, okay? And they say, okay, the values I'm trying to move away from here are rejection. I really hate the feeling of being rejected. I have a massive fear of failure, and I would hate to be humiliated. Now, when you put them side by side, the powerful thing here is you start to see where there's a conflict. And I'll come on to the theory of indecision in a second. But if your top value you're trying to move towards is love, but the value you're trying to move away from is rejection, let's imagine you're single. How on earth are you going to go and meet someone? Because you're pulling yourself into two different areas. On the one hand, you're like, okay, I want to go and have love. I want to put myself out there, so on and so forth. But I'm so scared of rejection. And that's where you start pulling yourself into two pathways. Similarly, you might massively value freedom. You're like, oh, I've got this side hustle. I want to leave my job and try this new thing, or start some kind of business, but your main fear is a fear of failure. And if you start something new, you know that you're going to fail. And again, you get the same tension. And you understand how this goes with the others. So this is a really powerful thing. If you can think through, okay, what are the top values I move towards and the top values I move away from, put them side by side right now and say, right, this is maybe going to be causing me some struggle. And don't worry, I won't be inundating you too much with graphs, but I pulled this from a medical paper, actually, because I thought it was quite a nice depiction of, if you're trying to optimize for one metric, you can have a good idea of how that changes over time. So this is actually from an NHS study. But broadly, let's say you were trying to make a decision and optimize for freedom. Okay, which of these job offers or which of these things I could do at the weekend is going to give me the most freedom? You could do the same for which would give me the most time, which would give me the most valuable memories with my friends. It's very easy for your brain to make a decision. But then when you're trying to optimize for several things, it becomes so difficult. And anyone who around the age of 15, 16, 17 was at school and was struggling to decide what subjects to take, because you're trying to think, okay, do I want to become a doctor or a lawyer, or do I want to go into economics, or do I want to do a completely different job? There's so many things in there that you're trying to think through. So it becomes very difficult. And this is where it becomes very difficult for your brain to get to a solution that works for you. So once you get your values aligned, you can make much better decisions. Now, I've got the picture here of Archimedes, because you might know this story whereby he was trying to understand a lot of physical concepts about sort of displacement and volume. He sat in a bath overflowed, and he realized, eureka, had a breakthrough. And you might have realized this, that sometimes when you're in the shower, you actually have your best ideas. Now, this is because there's an area of the brain called the default mode network, and this is most active during periods of rest and quiet wakefulness. What this is saying is, when your brain is not actively engaged on focusing on a task, you're doing something mundane, washing the dishes, showering, going for a walk, this is when you're doing your deep processing. And so if you have sort of a question that you've given to yourself, is the situation in which you will get to a solution. So if you're trying to pick between two job offers, if you're trying to pick something to do at the weekend, or if you're struggling with some kind of decision in your life, if you haven't got your values straight, your brain has no chance of getting to a really clear solution. But once you get to an idea of exactly what you're trying to optimize, then you're going to get more and more of these eureka moments, and it'll be easy for you to make good decisions consistently. So once you've done that, what you can do is you can take the similar list and be like, okay, what do I want my core values to be? It might be that the ones you're moving towards are similar and you might be on a good track, but it might be you need to reassess, let's say, your significant fear of failure and rejection if you are thinking you want to move or change career or start a new business. As an extension, if I were to ask you, okay, take your list of values you want to move towards, how easy is it for you to fill them? You probably would struggle. How often each day do you feel senses of love or freedom or adventure or excitement? But if I asked you, how often do you feel the values you want to move away from, guilt or rejection or humiliation or frustration or anger, it's a lot easier to say. So what you want to try and do is flip that and make it really easy to feel the values you want. One of my clients this week was actually saying that she feels loved any time now that she drinks water. She's nourishing herself, she's feeding herself. And the more you can make these things easier, the more you get yourself into an optimal state to make good decisions and see the best out of life. Similarly, you want to make it really difficult to feel some of the feelings you don't want and have it only when you consistently do a certain thing. And this brings me on to something I was talking about this weekend, which is mental models. Now, Charlie Munger and George Mack talk a lot about this. Charlie Munger was the original, George Mack does a lot of tweets on this. And what this is saying is you're trying to take ideas from, say, physics, economics, and apply them into your life. And this inversion trick is so useful. If you're trying to decrease a value or emotion, let's say stress or anxiety or something in your life, just invert it for a second and say, okay, if I were trying to maximize this, if I was trying to feel as stressed or as anxious as I could, as much as possible, what would I do? And there's two examples here where this has been pretty powerful. One, I was talking to one of my clients who was a doctor, and he was feeling stressed, sort of started dropping the ball with a few things, and he was picking up a lot of changing shift work. And he's a smart guy in terms of he knows a lot about the human body. So I said to him, okay, if you were trying to mess up your like stress levels, really, put a lot of weight on yourself, what's the first thing you would do? Well, you start messing around with your sleep schedule. And so this really clearly points it out to you. Similarly, someone else I was talking to, she was kind of struggling with a lot of anxiety, climate anxiety, things like this. And what she had mentioned was the first thing she did in the morning was woke up and watched the news. And this is inundating yourself with things that you have minimal to no control over, very far away. And it's often quite negative, dramatic events. And so I said, what's the first thing you would do if you were trying to make yourself as anxious as possible? You'd probably watch lots of videos of, horrific torture and things that are going on in the world. Now, I'm not saying that you should be completely ignorant of what's going on in the world, but I would definitely batch process it, ideally read it instead of watching it all the time, and definitely not first thing in the morning. It's a little trick you can use if you are trying to switch your core values or how you're feeling. So take that one away. So to finish this little section, in terms of clarity, the main thing we're trying to get to here, and as I said, this has been an absolute whistle-stop tour, is to understand your core values, so what's really important to you in life. Then you can get to a point with the Ikigai exercise of what is the idea of that core purpose you might be working on. Now, there's a whole separate piece that's really important, which is understanding your limiting beliefs and reframing them. That's something kind of, I guess, best done with coaching. But if you do want some extra exercises, check out Franklin Covey's personal mission statements and a free MBTI test. And if you want to have a list of all the self-reflection questions that I do, just drop me a message. So we've now got to a point where we've got a good idea of who we are, maybe, right? You've done the Ikigai exercise, so you know, okay, this is my purpose. You've maybe done the Wheel of Life, so you know where you're at. You've done that life audit, and maybe you start to have an idea of what the 10 out of 10 version is. But what a lot of people have is, if I said to most people I know, if you won the lottery, or if you could do anything next year, what would you go and do? Most people would say, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it. I wouldn't think like that. Without knowing where you want to go, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you actually want to grow. So direction is very key. I love these quotes here. Oscar Wilde, wisdom is to have dreams big enough not to lose sight when we pursue them. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, if your dreams do not scare you, they are not big enough. I think that when we're children, we're so good at daydreaming, aiming high and thinking, what if? And over time, we kind of start to lose that. And this is not to say that we shouldn't be realistic, but it's definitely to say that you should have pretty big goals you're working towards. And the first exercise here I want to say is happy 80th birthday. I've actually never done this before, so I found this pretty odd, but it's apparently an AI version of me when I'm 80. The reason why we're doing this is one thing that's a very powerful technique or visualization to do if you're trying to think about, okay, what's my life going to look like? Where do I actually want to go? Is imagine it's your 80th birthday. And every area of your life is a 10 out of 10. Just picture who's going to be at this 80th birthday with you. Is it your partner? Is it your future children, your friends? Imagine which two people do a speech. And what do you want them to say about your life and your character? What you want them to say about your character is really important as a sort of checkpoint on those values. Are you embodying these things? Now imagine that someone says, okay, what result have you achieved in your life? This is sort of called a technique called future belonging, where you're projecting yourself into the future and thinking, okay, it's my 80th birthday. I'm looking back. What do I want to have achieved? What would be the most amazing stuff to have done? Because all too often people get older and they realize, oh, I spent way too long doing X. Often, if you've read those sort of articles on, what's often said in hospices or people by their deathbed, it's like, oh, I wish I didn't work so long. I wish I'd spent more time doing the things that I truly enjoyed. What we're trying to do here is skip out that and like minimize any regret by thinking about it preemptively. The reason being, the exercises we spoke through, you should have a pretty good idea of what you love and what you really enjoy. So this is a really good first exercise to do, to kind of step back and think, okay, where do I kind of want to get to? So that's definitely one to take away and have a think about. The next thing I want to talk about in this direction piece is the idea of possibility drops. There's a coach called Brooke Castillo who talks a lot about this. But often we have very constrained thinking, especially, it depends on your culture, but I know in the UK, it's almost like you're picking between corporate jobs or like small avenues. But what you want to do here is an exercise where you just step back and go, I could quit my job and become a chef. I could retrain and go back to school. I could go and move to a different country. Just outline all the different things that you could do. Doesn't mean you need to do them, but what's powerful here is when you're trying to create your life, this is at the area called lifestyle design. Every time you create an idea, you're creating a possibility. Now, of course, you can just put that aside, but even the act of creating a possibility is a first step to something new. If you look at where your life is now, and maybe you're not completely happy with it, it's maybe, that 6, 7, 8 out of 10 that I've spoken about, but it's not the 10. Sometimes you haven't even thought about what the 10 could be. Perhaps you do want to live somewhere else. Perhaps you do want to do a different job. But if you don't take the time to step back and think, you're not even going to be able to start thinking about the steps you need to take to get there. And the one key thing here I would say is make sure you write this sort of thing down. Your brain was designed and evolved to create ideas, but not to store them. If you think about sort of humans as we evolved, when there's danger in the wild or so, like things like this, we come up with several ideas, we try one and we move on. We don't need to store that idea necessarily in the future or a whole list of them. So make sure that when you are going through these things, you're making a note. So we've got an idea now of, okay, what would we like to have achieved by our 80th birthday? And now we've started stepping back and thinking, okay, what are all the different possibilities I could do to make sure I'm not constrained in my thinking? The number one thing here with all of this is to think big. Ask yourself, what would you do if you could not fail? If there was absolutely no chance that you could fail, what's the first thing you go and do? Now that's pretty powerful, and most people would never do that. And what you can start to do is embody the identity of that person. So if you say, if I knew I couldn't fail, well, I would start, offering out my services to people in this new job I want to do. I would actually go and talk to those people. I would try that sport, whatever it is. And then you can start thinking about little ways to embody that. This is probably my favorite quote now. I love quotes, that's saying quite a lot. But Pablo said, my mother said to me, if you are a soldier, you'll become a general. If you are a monk, you'll become the Pope. Instead, I was a painter and became Picasso. Now, I'm not saying that everyone is necessarily going to become a Picasso. And that's fine, because not everyone wants to be globally renowned, top of one specific skill. People want to be the best version of themselves. What I'm trying to get you to do here is think about, okay, what is the optimal version of me? Because once we have an idea of where we're going, all the strategy, the road mapping and stuff, that's fine. And that's what you learn and you practice in your job. But it would be a disservice, especially when you're in your 20s, your 30s, to not even start thinking about how big and how high you could aim. Now, in terms of when we then have an idea of what kind of life we lead, I'm pretty sure most of you will have heard the acronym of SMART or SMARTER goals. Setting goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, evaluated, and rewarded. The second two came later by Duran in a paper a year later. And you can apply this to the wheel of life that we spoke about earlier. So, for each of these areas of my life, I think this is another one of my clients, you'd say, okay, for let's say my learning or my personal development, over the next 90 days, what are 1 or 2 goals that I'd love to achieve? And you can just really easily start, instead of just having very broad ones, you can actually start prioritizing, picking areas of your life. And the reason I'm talking about this is there's actually quite a lot of slack at the moment towards New Year's resolutions. I personally do set New Year's resolutions, but I don't just set New Year's resolutions. I guess I see them as annual goals that I sort of check over time and review and break down, which I'll come on to. But most people's New Year's resolutions, as you see here, this is a Statista study looking at Americans this year. Lots of them want to save more money and eat healthier. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you will at some point have come up with these resolutions. Now, the problem with these often is that people say, I want to achieve X by the end of the year. And this is normal, right? Like in most people's work life, they'll have some kind of, they're a salesperson, they'll have a sales target by the end of the year. They might have a promotion they're working towards, a certain number of projects, whatever it is. It's quite common to have, okay, by the end of the year, we're getting here. And you can apply this to your life and say, okay, we've done the work on this is where I want to get to where I'm 80. This is an idea of sort of all the possibilities. And okay, I've done the Wheel of Life thing. I've got an idea now over 5 years, over 3 months or whatever it is, where I want to get to. The next thing to think about then is the strategy. Strategy is basically a plan of how you get from A to B. So this is what really sort of separates out those who are just dreamers and those who are just doers. And dreaming, as I said, is so important because most people don't even do that. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now going through goal attainment, how to actually get to your goals. I'm going to touch on some key tips, things like scheduling, prioritization, time management, and habits. So to start with, let's say you had a New Year's resolution or a sales target. It could be the same thing. You could want to make, if you're a salesperson, or save, let's say if it was a personal thing, 10 grand by the end of the year. Now, if you were a salesperson, or if you know salespeople and you give them an annual target, the very first thing they do is probably break it down into a quarterly target. And so, okay, let's assume that it's something where you have, let's say, one-off revenue as opposed to like recurring cumulative revenues. They'll break it down to a quarterly target. And they'll probably go, actually, you know what, let's break it down to a monthly target. So the first thing you might do when you have a big goal is top down, go, okay, let's break it down into something more manageable. You probably even go weekly. But then the key part of this strategy is not just focusing on the outcomes, the end results, but you've got to focus on the inputs. And this is why a lot of people don't like New Year's resolutions. It's because they say, oh, it's not about goals. It's also about, you've got to think about what you're doing to get there. And I'd say, well, it's a balance of the two. Of course, you don't want to just set a New Year's resolution, but it's a lot better to at least have some kind of idea of the goals you're trying to get to, as opposed to nothing. But yes, once you've set the kind of goals that you're getting to, you've got to think about, okay, what are the steps that are getting me there? And if you were a salesperson with this kind of target, let's say it worked out to be just over $200 a week, you'd be like, okay, how many calls or outbound messages do I need to make? How many meetings do I need to book? How many sales do I therefore need to make to get to that target? And we can do this for our life. Now, one of the key things, I don't know if anyone's read the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People book, one of my favorites. I keep it here on my desk. But what Stephen Covey talks a lot about is the power of scheduling. And he says the key is not to prioritize what's on your schedule, but to schedule your priorities. Abraham Lincoln there with a fantastic quote, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree and I'll spend the first 4 sharpening the axe. And now, of course, you can overdo this. You don't want to spend your whole time thinking about doing things. There's also, you need to have a bias for action. However, I think that what's been very powerful for me and a lot of people I know who are very, very productive in the sense that they set goals and they hit them is seeing your to-do list as a sort of midway point. You can have a to-do list, but the way that that stuff actually becomes a done list is by moving it into your calendar. Personally, I'll use the calendar on my phone. You might have one on your wall, but instead of just having a list, if you can actually schedule in when you're going to do something, you're already so far ahead of so many people. I share this on my Instagram every week, partly just because I've always done this anyway, and I actually thought it'd be quite useful for people to see. Also, I guess it gives me some accountability to be like, okay, every week I'll say, these are my goals for the week. And at the end of the week, I'll say, okay, well, this is how I got on. And the reason why I keep doing this is because there's this really good, I heard this on a Chris Williamson podcast. I don't listen to too many, but this is one that I actually really enjoyed. At this point where he says, okay, what feels productive that isn't, and what doesn't feel productive that is. And at the top part for me, it might be things like clearing my email or like deleting emails that I don't need anymore. But on the bottom, something that sometimes doesn't feel productive is spending this upfront time planning and thinking. But when I look back, it always pays itself back tenfold. And once you've scheduled, the next key thing here to do is to set deadlines. So we've got an idea of the end goals. We've then broken those down into sub-goals, and we've got an idea of the actions we need to take to get there. We've then scheduled in, okay, I need to do this. But instead of just scheduling in, okay, I'm going to start that on Monday morning, you want to set a time-bound period. And this is that point about like goals being time-bound. But instead of just having a deadline, you have a start and an end point. This is Parkinson's law, which says work expands to fill the time available for its completion. And you've probably found this, right? If you set aside a whole day to pack before you go on holiday, it can actually take the whole day. And if you have half an hour to get it done, you'll get it done. Obviously, there's a balance here by giving yourself enough time to actually complete the work, but you can kind of have a pretty good idea normally of how much is needed. And even just by setting in your calendar, let's say 40-minute or 20-minute kind of slot, you'll make yourself so much more productive. The next key thing I want to talk about in this strategy section is prioritization. This is something I read in Oliver Burkeman's 4,000 Weeks, which is a fantastic book if anyone's thought about it. 4,000 weeks is the average length of a human life, which when you hear it is actually pretty shocking at the start, just very startling. And what he talks about is having a fixed volume approach to productivity. What this means is loads of people have a to-do list, especially at work, it might be like endless. And there are some things that might stay on there for years. And so, yes, it's good to keep track of all the things you need to do, and you can put that into some sort of list, and you might split that by the areas of your life and so on and so forth. But what you want to do on a weekly and daily basis is then adopt a fixed volume approach to productivity. And this might mean that you have a shorter closed to-do list that only has 10 things on it, and you can never add anything unless one thing is already completed. And you can break that down within a week. I personally, for each of the roles in my life, will have max 1 or 2 things that I really, really want to do that week. And then within each day, regardless of the areas of my life, I'll have only 1 or 2 things I really prioritize and over everything else. So once you have this fixed volume approach, you can actually make sure you're really doing the things that matter. And this is one way to make sure that you're focusing on the right things. You might have heard of the Pareto principle at work or maybe at school in economics. And it's Vilfredo Pareto who discovered this when he was actually researching pea pods in his garden. He realized that 80% of his peas came from 20% of the pea pods. And he was realizing, okay, there's some kind of system here where a small amount of the inputs is producing a large amount of the outputs. He then discovered that 20% of the Italian population owned 80% of the land. So we started looking at other areas where he could see this. And now we see it everywhere in business. 20% of a business's customers will bring in 80% of the revenue. 20% of bugs in tech and software leads to 80% of the downtime. And so what you can think about in your life is you start applying this and think, okay, which 20% of activities and people and things bring 80% of my desired outcomes? What's also pretty powerful to do is to flip that round and say, well, which 20% of activities, people, and things bring 80% of my problems? And this is a really powerful thing to take a second to do. And you balance that with prioritization. And you say, okay, this is now the 2, 3, 4 things that I need to do this week that will actually really be game changing. I reckon every single client I see says they want to work on procrastination, and they immediately say, oh, it's a time management thing. I just need to make myself work more or set more apps on my phone to block social media and so on and so forth. And I always kind of notice that this is always very surface level stuff. Most time management issues are not time management issues. I love Dr. Tim Pitchell's quote here. Procrastination is an emotion regulation problem, not a time management problem. So what they're saying is there's a reason you procrastinate. There's a reason you reach for your phone. There's a reason you go and do something else. And that's because there's an emotional driver there most of the time. Obviously, this varies, but broadly, this is the most important thing to get your head around if you do find yourself procrastinating and you want to get on top of it. And there's a 4-step process for this. So if you find yourself procrastinating, and if that is a big thing, this is probably the biggest takeaway for you. So definitely pay attention here. The first thing you want to do is notice, what am I feeling right now? So as soon as you catch yourself reaching for your phone, going to doom scroll, you just started, well, what am I feeling right now? Then you want to name the emotion. Are you feeling overwhelmed by all the things you need to do, all the work, all the homework you need to mark, all the tasks on your plate? Are you scared of failure? You thought about working on your side hustle, but you don't even know if it's going to work. Are you anxious about the end result or what other people will think? Just name that feeling. Because once you've done that, you can start to get power over it and understand it. and then you can reframe it. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, you can reframe that as, okay, I just want to progress. Fear of failure, you think, okay, I'm just doing this for myself. And this is why that growth mindset, as I said, pervades throughout, and why I've structured my whole program and coaching around this. And finally, you want to take a tiny action. I'm talking this should be laughably small. You can say, I'm just going to open my notes and read over where I was last. I'm just going to type the question into ChatGPT, or I'm just going to write one line. I'm just going to read one line. And so to apply this to an example that I see quite a lot, people say they have a problem with doom scrolling. So I say, okay, well, why do you go and doom scroll? How do you feel when you doom scroll? What sort of caused you to start doom scrolling? And often it's because they're overwhelmed by some sort of seemingly limitless task. They've got so much to do, they don't even know where to start. And this is why social media is so attractive, because it's also limitless. You can scroll indefinitely. So instead, what people might be trying to do is they have ridiculously high expectations for themselves. So they're being a perfectionist and they're thinking, oh, why would I start when I've got so much to do that I'm never going to complete it perfectly, or I've never done this before. And if you can flip that to say the goal here is to just progress, not to do something perfect. And this links back to limiting beliefs. Then you can reframe it to have a tiny, tiny task. So instead of, oh, I'm going to finish my MVP, or, oh, I'm going to complete all the work I needed to do, all you're going to do is just try one thing. Once you get started, action reduces anxiety, and then momentum takes over. You'll probably find this, that if you start working for 1 minute, you'll end up working for half an hour, 2 hours, or whatever it is. And some other days, if you don't start, you won't do anything. A couple of final tools to wrap up this section then is the Eisenhower matrix, which Stephen Covey again speaks about in the 7 habits. To talk through each of these individually, because it's quite powerful. In the top left here, you have the first quartile. So things that are urgent and important. The two axes here are urgency and importance. Something that's urgent and important, imagine like your house is on fire. You have to do it now, right? It's a crisis, it's an emergency. It's very urgent and it's very important. Do it right now. Then we have things, if we go down, like urgency and not important. So something like an app notification. It happens immediately, or an email. It happens immediately, but it's probably not that important. Same as irrelevant meetings that come up, things that interrupt you. And this is where we want to not spend too much time here, right? If we can, we delegate these things, or we batch process them. Then we move along to the bottom right. It's things that are not urgent and not important. Okay, this is stuff we want to completely avoid. This can be things like doom scrolling, depending on you as a person, things that you perceive to waste your time. That might be gossip, that might be watching certain types of things or listening to certain type of things, consuming certain content. Now, in the top right here, this is where we want to focus. Things that are important, but not urgent. And a great example here is stuff like planning, self-reflection, building relationships, exercise. You never need to go to the gym right now. You know it's important, but you never need to do it right now. The same as you never need to plan your life. Think about your goals. Think about where you want to go, what you enjoy. Reflect on your wins. You never need to do them right now, but you probably know it's important. And when you ask people, okay, over the past week, the past month, past quarter, past year, if you would have done one thing differently that would have improved your life, what would it be? 9 times out of 10, it's something here. So if you actually want to improve your life, think about the things in this top right area that you can do and you want to do more of, and then schedule these in. Use the prioritization framework I told you about, and this is where game changing happens. So this is what we want to focus on. Now, to finish up this section, I could do a whole lecture on habit frameworks and things like this. The most popular book in recent times is James Clear's Atomic Habits, where he talks about this habit loop. There's similar ones in Duhick's Power of Habit, which I've also read, which is the kind of original in this field that I came across first. But the idea is you want to set up a cue. If you want to make a new habit, let's say you want to start going to the gym, you want to have some kind of cue that triggers, oh, okay, this is when this happens. You want to have some kind of craving. So as well as making it obvious with the cue, you want to make it attractive. Then you want to make it easy. So what's the actual habit going to be? How can we make that as easy and frictionless as possible? And what's the reward? Now, some key things here to think about are, especially with going to the gym, you'll probably know, if you get your clothes laid out ready the day before, you're much more likely to get going. If you can habit stack it, so okay, when do you go to the gym? You can add that to a habit you already do. Maybe it's after you have your breakfast, it's after your commute home. Or if you want to do more gratitude, maybe it's after you clean your teeth. You add it onto habits that you already do. And then one that's really underused is actually the reward. So if you do go to the gym, then you maybe do something that you do like. I know people that go on Instagram only after they've planned their week or they've done so on and so forth, right? Personally, I won't go on my phone until I've done my sort of morning routine. And you get those sort of dopamine hits, you check notifications or whatever it is. So build into your life the kind of habits that you want following this framework. And the important thing here, I love this quote from James Clear, is your identity emerges from your habits. So every action you do is a vote for the person you wish to become. Personally, I'll exercise every single day. And the reason is I want to be the type of person who is active. And so obviously, sometimes I don't feel like going to the gym. Sometimes I don't have a great gym session. But the whole point is that I'm acting in line with the identity I want. And throughout this whole thing, we've spoken a lot about goals and how to get to where you want. But it's very important to step back and think about, okay, what was the point of all this? What we're trying to do is live a life that really fills us with purpose and enjoyment. And part of that is, as we're going along this journey, you want to enjoy it without wanting to get too deep. And I love this quote by Oliver Burkeman, results aren't everything. And results always come later, and later is always too late. So if you're constantly being like, oh, I want to run this marathon, I want to do this, I want to earn this amount of money, I want to live here. It's also important to think about why you're doing that. It's probably because you think, oh, when I get to this point, I will feel this certain way. So what you want to actually do is embody the identity of that person earlier and start giving yourself those, acting along those values, living that identity, that behavior that you want to become, because that makes every step along the way part of an amazing journey. And then what you don't get is this sense of constantly pushing further goals and always saying, oh, I'll be happy when X, Y, Z. And this is why that rewarding part, the sort of celebrating successes, is so key. And this is why as well, as well as having a to-do list, it's really powerful to have a done list. So key takeaways from today. The first thing I'd say is start with what you love. With the Ikigai area, you've heard this all the time, right? But it is so important if you actually want to make a difference in the world and do something that you'll be really good at, that you'll have the drive to do, and you'll actually be your best version in. Just start with the things you enjoy, and it'll make the whole process a lot more fun. Second, think big and aim high. We dream a lot as children, and if you think back to what 7-year-old you wanted to do, you had no problem dreaming then. So if we can rediscover some of that magic, then you'll be on to a winner. Third, schedule your to-do list. If you just have a to-do list and you don't schedule it in, honestly, I reckon that is one of the biggest game changers for my personal productivity. The fourth one would be understand your procrastination. The key thing here, I'd say, is to be empathetic. We haven't really had time to go into limiting beliefs and sort of where these beliefs were formed in your childhood and things like that. But the reason why you're feeling that overwhelmedness, the reason why you're feeling the fear of failure comes from your childhood. So normally, identify that emotion, that feeling, and deal with that first, and then you'll be absolutely bawling. And the fifth and final key takeaway, I'd say, is to adopt a growth mindset. As I said, it's what we're trying to do here is make you and help you enjoy your life and constantly be growing and on a journey. My life is not perfect. What it is better this week than it was last week, and it's better in this month than it was last month, and this year than last year. And I just know that I'm growing as a person, and this is what I'm trying to help you guys do, is just keep growing. And a lot of the questions are around like, oh, okay, what's a 7 out of 10? What's a 10 out of 10? Whatever. The whole point is you just want to keep growing and enjoying your life and developing as a person. If you do this, then as new challenges come, you'll be licking your lips. I'm going to finish with these 3 quotes that I absolutely love. So Billie Jean King, pressure is a privilege, you get to grow. I did a poll recently on my stories about which situations bring out the best in you. And for me, often it is a setback or a challenge. And that led to a massive uptick in my growth journey. So now whenever I see some kind of challenge, I'm almost licking my lips thinking, right, here we go. This is a great opportunity for me to grow. Tony Robbins, the OG life coach, growth begins at the end of your comfort zone. And Zig Ziglar, you don't have to be good to start, but you do have to start to be good. So anyone thinking about, changing their career or starting a passion, moving in, really starting to strive for their 10 out of 10 version of their life, what I would do is start thinking about what you really enjoy and really have this growth mindset, and you'll be onto a winner. So that concludes my talk about 360-degree growth strategies. This is the kind of thing I go through in my program, where I help young professionals escape that region beta paradox I spoke about quite a lot. So the idea of being stuck on a 7 out of 10 life, and we apply a lot of corporate strategies and deep personal development to get people living their 10 out of 10 lifestyle. And a lot of that is about understanding who they are, what that 10 out of 10 lifestyle looks like, and then setting the strategies in place to get there. What that means is you can then see your wheel of life as it is and grow it out to a 10 out of 10 version. And over time, you see your life improve. I'll finish off then with a few questions. Feel free to pop in the chat box any questions you have. I had a couple listed before, so I will start there. And feel free to just message me if you have any others as we go. But some of the ones I had from before. First, if you're in your 30s, not fully satisfied with your career and trying to find your thing, where would you start? Definitely with the Ikigai. I think that for me, when I knew that I wanted to move to Australia, and I knew I wasn't really not happy, but I was fine, 7 out of 10 in the job and the career I was doing. The most powerful thing for me was to actually balance the like what you love, what you're good at, what you can be paid for, what the world needs. Because for me, then I knew that it was something within coaching, consulting, teaching, or something, but something I was passionate about and helping people improve their lives. That didn't give me the answer, but that definitely sort of framed my thinking to then be like, okay, I know now where I'm going to go. And you might have heard of something called the law of attraction, which talks about, okay, you attract into life certain things. And I feel like there's a much more spiritual and a much less spiritual way of talking about it. And it's the same in my head as when you hear a new word. Suddenly you hear that everywhere. That word was always there. You're just more in tune to picking up on it. So once you've done an exercise like the Ikigai thing and you have an idea of what you kind of want from life and what maybe your types of purpose is, doesn't mean you're going to have the answer straight away. But you are going to start picking up on things like, okay, if you know it's something about you really love coding and you love solving challenges and you're really passionate about, I don't know, your like national food dish, you might not have an answer yet. You might not have a business idea. You might not have the job you want to go and do, but suddenly you'll start reading articles and pulling things together, and that's where you start getting progress. Okay, I've got another question here. How do I know if a 10 out of 10 life is even possible to be achieved? Isn't there nothing perfect? And how do I know if I'm being unrealistic in my goals? I guess first, in terms of how do you know if it's being achieved, all of this is self-reflective. So you are determining what you think is a 7 or a 10 or a 9 or whatever out of 10 in your life. It's a completely arbitrary scale, right? And it's fully qualitative. However, fundamentally at the bottom, you kind of know how you're feeling and how happy you are, and you can kind of compare where you want to be and where you are. So in terms of how you know where you're at, that's how it is. But to your question about can it even be achieved? I love Henry Ford's quote where he said, whether you think you can or you can't, either way, you are right. Now, it's not to say, obviously, that, well, it is to say, I'd say that anyone can do anything, obviously, assuming that they really believe it and they act according to it. Now, and if you think of sort of the idea of, okay, what do you want to do in your life? Is it too unrealistic to go for it? There's two situations here. One is, okay, you set yourself a massive dream and you dedicate yourself to really going for it. You get there or you don't. But you've given yourself the best possible chance to achieve your dream. So in my head, that's a much better decision. It's like Pascal's wager. Second, and the second point, how do you know if you're being unrealistic in your goals? I guess I think goals should be like, as Oscar Wilde says, big enough that you're excited to pursue them and, almost like you couldn't believe if they come true. But to that smart goals, part of it is it's got to be attainable to you. So that's a kind of self-check point. And what it might be is that a goal is something you're working towards is maybe it's not quite the full version isn't really possible within the next year. Maybe that's a 2-year goal, but what's the 3-month goal? Okay, cool. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay, next one. Do you have any strategies for narrowing down and prioritizing a long list of goals into manageable chunks? Yes. So narrowing down and prioritizing a long list. So this is, I guess, that fixed volume productivity list of, it's good to have the long list, and then you can go down into the short list. I know your question is how, I'll come on to that. So yeah, have your long list, that's fine. Then we get into the short list. So the quick thing you can do is the Pareto analysis. So think about each one and go, you can even, if you've done them before, look in the past and say, okay, which is the 20% that kind of gave me the biggest 80% of outcomes? That's probably the first place to start, because this is how you really optimize your time. That's probably the number one strategy for breaking down and prioritizing the long list into manageable chunks. Similarly, let's say you're trying to, I don't know, you're launching a new project, and you've got such a long list of things to do, and yeah, you don't even know what's a manageable chunk. There's this idea of sort of like putting the stones and the pebbles in first, or eat the frog. You might have heard of these ideas. And what this is saying is, imagine if you had a jar and you had rocks of loads of different sizes that you had to put in to the jar. What you wouldn't want to do is put all the small rocks in first, the little pebbles, and then you put the stones in, and eventually you're left with two massive rocks that you can't fit in the jar. You put the big ones in first, and then the smaller ones come later, and so on and so forth. So if you've tried already the Pareto analysis, the next one to do is to start with the biggest, meatiest, and what you think is the most important tasks. So what you don't do is skirt around the edges for ages and not actually get any progress. And this is the idea of eat the frog, where it's like, okay, if you have to eat, it's a weird analogy, but if you have to eat a frog, you eat the biggest frog first, and you tackle the biggest thing first in your day. And that's another thing. A lot of people, Andrew Huberman talks a lot about this. It's like, okay, in the morning, as early as you can, do the number one thing that's going to give you the biggest results. And so if you look at your super, super, super long list, just be really brutal and be like, okay, if I did one of these by the end of the week, what's the most important? And just start there and go down. That's the idea of think about it in different sizes of rocks. Hope that helps. Any other questions? I'll give it a few seconds. Maybe it's just those three. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I hope you found that useful. I am completely aware that it was a massive whirlwind of information. As I said, if you want to access any of the resources or anything like that, just drop me a message. And if you want to come along to any more, I'll be doing webinars probably monthly. You can follow me on Instagram. You can see it there, Georgie Hearn Life Coaching, where I share a lot of tips and things like this. And if you are interested in exploring a coaching relationship to sort of apply these to your life, then feel free to just reach out. Otherwise, thank you and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.